Welcome to this Ossett History podcast on the impact of war on Britain. For this particular exam, it requires you to have a good grasp of the history, the background history of the home front during the First and Second World Wars. You'll be given a set of sources in the exam and you'll be asked 5 questions. It's extremely important that you familiarise yourself with the 5 types of questions you'll be asked and really think and find out and practice how to set out your answers and which things you have to do to get the top marks. With that in mind, what you need to be aware of is that for most of the questions you cannot get very good or even good marks without showing that you have some of your own knowledge. It specifically states the words own knowledge in the mark schemes. So this podcast aims to give you the basics in terms of subject knowledge on this topic. Generally speaking, you should be aware that for most aspects of the home front in the First World War, Britain took a little while to adjust to the situation. But by the end of the war, the home front was organised to give the British the best possible chance of winning the war. In contrast, by the time the Second World War came around, technology was more advanced, attitudes to things were slightly different, but most importantly, the British had already lived through one World War and knew what would be needed of them on the home front for the country to be able to fight the war as successfully as possible. For example, in the First World War, rationing was not enforced until 1918, but though there had been, or not been, any food shortages yet, the British introduced rationing towards the start of the Second World War in January 1940. That shows that we'd learnt important lessons in the First World War, and we therefore were more prepared for the Second. The threats that Britain faced in the World Wars changed as the technology advanced. To begin with, German Zeppelin raids were the first major threat to people on the home front. They must have been terrifying, but in war terms, they caused a relatively small number of casualties over the total of 2 years, just 564. If you contrast that with the advanced technology of the V2 rockets at the end of the Second World War, fired over a period of just 7 months, they killed 9,000 people. In the same period, between the first Zeppelin raid and the last V2 rocket raid, the British citizens' ability to protect or defend themselves also improved. Certainly from the First to the Second World War. For example, in the First World War, during the Zeppelin and then the Gotha bomber raids, there were no air raid shelters. But in the Second World War, there were public shelters, and private in-home shelters such as Morrison or Anderson shelters. So again, we'd learnt lessons, and we were more prepared for the Second World War. The Blitz of the Second World War was undoubtedly the biggest trauma that the British have ever faced on the home front. The aims of the Germans was to disrupt industry and to destroy civilian morale. The Germans never really achieved their aims. Most factories were able to resume production within 2 or 3 days, even if they did get hit by a bomb. But the difficulties of high-level precision bombing in the middle of an air battle meant that few factories ever got hit. As for civilian morale, rather than destroy it, the British seemed to only become more determined in the face of the German attacks. This reaction of the British public has become known as the Blitz spirit, though it is likely that the Blitz spirit was exaggerated to help keep morale high in what must have been a very traumatic, worrying and often heartbreaking period to live through. By showing images of people keeping up a cheerful appearance in the face of the devastating bombing, it helped to keep spirits up. Despite not disrupting industry, significantly anyway, and not destroying civilian morale, the German Luftwaffe still did huge amounts of damage in their bombing campaign. For example, 12,500 people were killed in just 1 month in London in December 1940. You must remember it wasn't just London that was hit by the Blitz, but lots of cities across the country. And one example is Portsmouth, who on just one night, the 30th of January 1940, during a huge German raid, 930 civilians were killed in just one night. Now when you rewind a little bit and compare that to the Zeppelin raids, which took place over 2 years, and in the total 564 people were killed, you can see just how much technology advanced and how damaging it was becoming to people on the home front, even though the front lines were far away. For that many people, 930 people in just one night to be killed, must have been traumatic, and it must have been very difficult for people to keep up this blitz spirit. Apart from the deaths, the blitz also had an impact on family life, with many children in large cities being evacuated to the countryside. This had a huge social impact. Now, if you talk about a social impact, social is how people live, how people interact. It had dramatic consequences for children and their families. Some children had good experiences of their time away. Some had less fortunate experiences. But all children involved spent most of 5 or 6 years away from their parents, which had an impact on the family unit. You can imagine it must have been quite difficult to readjust when you're sent back to your parents who you might not have seen for a number of years. The conditions of war also meant that volunteers were needed, and thus in the Second World War, the air raid precautions officers and the local defence volunteers, who later became known as the Home Guard, were founded. The ARPs were often disliked for their enforcement of the blackout rules, but by the end of the war, many were seen as heroes for helping to save lives. 7,000 ARPs died during the Second World War. The Home Guard were ultimately never needed, as the German invasion didn't come, but the volunteers, aged 17 to 65 and otherwise unfit for or excused from regular active service, numbered 1.6 million by June 1941. They did see some action in manning anti-aircraft guns during air raids. Propaganda and censorship was used by the government in both wars to help to maintain high morale amongst the population and to encourage specific ideas or behaviours. Propaganda was usually made to encourage volunteers, to help with morale, or to emphasise that the war that the British was fighting was a just cause. But there were other reasons too, as you can see from these examples. Censorship was used to prevent important information getting to the Germans, or to prevent negative information from having an impact on morale. Newspapers, films, soldiers' letters, and in the Second World War the radio, were all subject to censorship. Propaganda and censorship had a significant impact on the home front during both wars. As for the attitudes of the people, generally speaking, in the First World War there was support for the war for the first 2 years, but in the second 2 years attitudes began to change as the war dragged on and due to the huge death toll at the front. In the Second World War, there was a sort of a sense of rolling up the sleeves and getting on with the job. Most people recognised that Hitler and the Nazis were a threat that had to be dealt with, and thus there was a general support for the war throughout. Of course, the government itself had to reorganise to be able to direct the home front and the war effort. In the First World War, the Defence of the Realm Act was passed to give the government unusual powers to act in the interests of the war effort. And in the Second World War, the Emergency Powers Act was passed for the same reason. Both acts meant that new laws did not have to be debated for months in Parliament before coming into effect. If it had been left as that, it would have been very damaging in wartime, as decisions have to be taken quickly to react to the situations that occur. Conscription was necessary, though it wasn't until volunteers began to dry up that it was introduced in the First World War. Conscription came into effect in January 1916. In the Second World War, conscription was introduced in September 1939, i.e. on the very outbreak of war. By December 1941, conscription was extended to include all women aged 20 to 30, who would never be in the front line fighting, but would be called up to do important war work behind the lines, such as joining the WAAF, the WRNS, the ATS, or working in munitions industries or on farms. From December 1943, men were called up to work not just as soldiers but in vital war work such as working down the mines. These men became known as Bevin Boys after the Minister of Labour who came up with this scheme and was called Ernest Bevin. Industry also had to be reorganised. Britain had huge industrial capacity, but it needed to be changed from producing everyday civilian products to war products. In both wars, the government began by nationalising certain industries, such as coal, which was vital for our ships to be able to move around the globe, or the railways, so that they could be best organised for the war effort. Nationalising means that the government took them over and ran them in the interests of the country. Again, in the Second World War, the British were more prepared than the First. Shadow factories had been built alongside existing factories that could easily be turned into working war factories for the benefit of the war effort. There was also a plan that on the outbreak of war, experts and managers in the motor industry would be transferred to help run the new armaments factories. Women played a huge role in both world wars, and you might recognise a similar pattern, because Britain was slow to make use of women in the First World War. By the Second World War, however, women were used in war work straight away. Indeed, as I have already said, by December 1941, women aged 20 to 30 were forced through conscription to contribute to the war effort. In the First World War, attitudes were very different, and women were not thought to be suitable to hard physical work, so initially they were given jobs as clerks in offices. However, by 1916, the shortages of labour were so great that women were sent to work in heavy industry, and they performed very well. Thus, by the Second World War, women had already proven capable, and were used wherever they were required from the outset of war. Women could work or choose to work in all sorts of occupations, or of course be conscripted to work in certain occupations during the Second World War. But the most well-known are the auxiliary forces attached to the men's armed forces, such as the WRNS, the WRAFS, or the WAAC, which later became known in World War II as the ATS. There was also the Women's Land Army, which was farming, or working in the munitions industries. Women never fought, but they nonetheless did dangerous jobs, and made a huge contribution to the war effort. As an example of the dangerous jobs that the women used to do, or at least to give you some idea of the situations they were putting themselves in, 335 women were killed during the Second World War whilst in the ATS. One final crucial aspect of the home front that we will look at in this podcast came as a result of the German submarine menace. Britain could not then, and still cannot, feed its population without importing food. Our island is simply too small to support the large population living here. Therefore, the Germans knew that if they could stop ships getting into England, they could starve us into submission. They got close to succeeding in both world wars. But to combat this on the home front, rationing was introduced. At first, rationing was voluntary, and therefore not very successful. In April 1917, it was said that Britain only had 6 more weeks left of supplies before people would begin to starve. From January 1918, rationing became compulsory. That pattern emerges again because in the Second World War, rationing was introduced close to the beginning of the war, in January 1940, despite food shortages not yet being a problem. We'd learnt the lessons of the First World War and used those hard-earned lessons to ensure we were a bit better at things and a little more prepared for the Second World War. In our next podcast, we will look at the legacy of the World Wars, consider the Boer War, and look in greater detail at the impact of war on women and society in general. I've been Mr. Otway, and this was an Osset History Podcast.